The sun burned over King's Landing, casting long shadows across the blood-stained stones of the Red Keep's courtyard. The air carried the stench of sweat, fear, and the quiet murmur of a city waiting for its next spectacle. Lord Eddard Stark, bound in chains, knelt before the assembled court. His once proud posture was broken, his face gaunt from weeks in the dungeons. Joffrey Baratheon sat on the Iron Throne, his smirk a twisted reflection of his cruel delight. Cersei Lannister sat beside him, her piercing green eyes watching closely, fingers curling around the golden lion brooch on her dress. The offer had been made. Confess to treason, bend the knee, and take the black, or refuse and die. Varys had whispered the so-called mercy in Ned's ear, and Sansa's tearful gaze pleaded with him from the crowd. The faces of those gathered were a mixture of expectation and pity. Even Pycelle, ever loyal to the throne, seemed to expect the words of submission to leave Ned's lips. Ned inhaled sharply. His honor had cost him everything: his men, his position, his family's safety. And now his life hung in the balance. He glanced toward the high walls of the Red Keep, wondering if Arya was out there somewhere, hiding, watching. If he bent the knee, he might see her again. But honor did not yield. He clenched his jaw and raised his voice, clear and unwavering despite his battered body. I demand trial by combat. A ripple of shock surged through the courtyard. The murmurs grew into a roar. Cersei's face tightened and Joffrey's smirk faltered. Littlefinger, lurking in the background, raised an amused brow. A trial by combat. A gamble of steel and blood. Cersei recovered quickly, her voice like silk hiding a dagger. You are accused of treason, my lord, she purred. Do you truly think the gods would fight for a traitor? The gods will decide, Ned replied simply. A laugh, sharp and mirthless, cut through the tension. Joffrey rose from the throne, stepping forward with the eager cruelty of a boy playing at kingship. Then let the gods decide, he declared. You may name your champion, Stark, but I will name Sir Gregor Clegane. A collective gasp followed. The Mountain, the beast of House Clegane, a giant of a man, stepped forward, his armor like an iron fortress. His helmet shadowed his face, but all knew the horror hidden beneath. The stories of his brutality spread from battlefield to battlefield, whispered by those who lived to tell of them. Ned's heart pounded, but he did not waver. Who will stand for the accused? Cersei asked, her lips curling in satisfaction. Silence fell. Ned's allies were few in King's Landing. His men were dead or imprisoned, his household scattered. Who would fight for a broken lord? A single voice broke the quiet. I will stand for Lord Stark. All heads turned toward the speaker. A knight stepped forward, tall and regal in white armor, the golden lion of Lannister gleaming on his cloak. Sir Barristan Selmy. Gasps filled the air. The old knight, dismissed from the King's Guard, now stood in defiance of the very regime that had cast him aside. His blue eyes burned with something fierce. Justice, perhaps, or vengeance for a lifetime of service repaid with insult. Cersei paled, but before she could object, Joffrey clapped his hands, laughing. Good, let the old man die like a dog. The trial will be held at dawn. The crowd roared as the guards pulled Ned to his feet. The die was cast. Tomorrow his fate would be decided by the sword. The dungeons of the Red Keep were damp with the scent of rot and old blood. The torches along the stone walls flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the iron bars. Ned Stark sat against the cold wall of his cell, his wrists still raw from the chains that had bound him for weeks. His body ached, but his mind remained sharp. He had made his choice. Trial by combat. Now the gods would decide his fate. He wasn't sure if he'd chosen it out of defiance or faith in justice. Either way, the moment he spoke those words, there was no turning back. A shuffling sound echoed through the corridor. The heavy door groaned open, and a man stepped inside. Even in the dim torchlight, Ned recognized him. Sir Barristan Selmy. The old knight looked at him with something close to respect, his face set in grim determination. "You have put great faith in the gods, Lord Stark," he said, his voice low but firm. "I pray they do not abandon us tomorrow." Ned managed a faint smile. "I could say the same to you, Sir Barristan. You have risked much by standing for me." Barristan shook his head. "No more than I already have. The day Joffrey dismissed me, he made an enemy of me, and I am a Kingsguard no longer. I owe the boy nothing." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But I do owe you, Lord Stark. Your father, Lord Rickard, was a great man. He deserved better than the flames. And you deserve better than this." Ned felt a pang at the mention of his father, but he kept his composure. "Tomorrow you will face Sir Gregor Clegane. Are you ready?" Barristan nodded, though there was no arrogance to his stance. He was a knight of honor, not a butcher. "I am not as young as I once was," he admitted, "but skill does not fade as quickly as strength. If I must fall, I will make the mountain bleed before I do." Ned looked at him, seeing the conviction in his eyes. A lifetime of loyalty, of duty. Perhaps the gods were just, after all. "Then may the gods favor your blade," Ned said. Barristan gave a respectful nod and turned to leave. Before stepping out, he paused. "Sleep if you can, Lord Stark. If I fall, you will not wake to see another dawn." The door creaked shut, leaving Ned alone once more. He exhaled, leaning his head against the cold wall. Somewhere Sansa was in a castle, frightened and alone. Somewhere beyond these walls, Arya was hiding in the city, possibly watching the events unfold. And in the north, Robb was raising his banners. Tomorrow everything could change. Tomorrow Steel would speak where words had failed. Dawn broke over King's Landing, bathing the Red Keep in a crimson glow. The city was alive with anticipation. Word had spread like wildfire. Eddard Stark, the traitor, had chosen trial by combat, and his champion was none other than Sir Barristan Selmy. Against him stood Sir Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides, the most feared warrior in Westeros. The courtyard was packed with nobles, soldiers, and common folk alike, eager to witness the spectacle. The Kingsguard stood in a solemn line, their white cloaks billowing in the morning breeze. Cersei sat rigid beside Joffrey, her fingers clenched around the armrest of her seat. Littlefinger smirked from the shadows, ever the silent observer. Varys, his face unreadable, merely watched. Sansa was there too, her hands clasped tightly as she trembled in fear. She had pleaded with the queen to stop this madness, but Cersei had only offered her a knowing smile. Ned stood near the platform, his wrists unshackled but still bearing the marks of his captivity. The chains were gone, but his fate remained uncertain. Then the combatants arrived. Sir Gregor Clegane lumbered onto the battlefield, his massive frame clad in thick steel. His great sword, nearly as tall as a man, rested in his gauntleted hands. His helm with its grotesque maw made him look less like a knight and more like a beast of war. Sir Barristan Selmy approached from the opposite end, his movements measured, precise. Though his armor was simpler, lacking the excessive plating of his opponents, It was forged for speed and agility. He carried his longsword with effortless grace, the stance of a man who had spent his entire life wielding it. Joffrey, grinning like a child at play, stood and raised a hand. "The gods will judge the traitor today. Let the trial begin." With those words, the mountain charged. The ground trembled beneath his steps as he swung his enormous blade in a wide arc, aiming to cleave Selmy in half. But Barristan was no fool. He sidestepped with remarkable speed, his white cloak fluttering as he dodged the devastating blow. The clang of steel rang out as Barristan countered with a swift strike, aiming for the gaps in the mountain's armor. His blade glanced off Gregor's shoulder, drawing the first blood of the duel. The crowd gasped. Gregor growled, his fury ignited. He swung again, this time with more calculation. Selmy ducked, rolling to the side, his sword flashing like lightning as he slashed across the mountain's leg. More blood. Joffrey frowned. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Cersei's expression darkened, but Gregor was not so easily bested. With a roar, he brought his blade down with earth-shattering force. Selmy barely dodged in time. The impact sent dust flying, and the ground cracked where the sword landed. For minutes, the duel raged. Barristan was faster, more precise, but Gregor was relentless, his brute strength making every clash of steel a contest of survival. Then it happened. Selmy miscalculated a dodge. The mountain's gauntlet caught his shoulder, sending him sprawling across the courtyard. Gasps erupted as the old knight struggled to rise, his sword still in hand but his body slow to obey. Gregor stalked forward, lifting his greatsword high for the killing blow. Ned's breath caught. Sansa sobbed. Joffrey grinned. But Barristan was not done. Summoning the last of his strength, he rolled away at the last second. Gregor's sword crashed into the stone, and in that heartbeat of vulnerability, Selmy struck. His blade found the gap beneath the mountain's arm, piercing deep. Gregor bellowed in rage. Selmy wrenched his sword free, his movements precise despite his exhaustion. The mountain staggered, blood pouring from his wound. He swung wildly, but his strength was waning. With one final stroke, Barristan drove his sword through Gregor's chest, piercing the beast's heart. The mountain fell. Silence consumed the courtyard. Then came the verdict. "The gods have spoken," Barristan said, turning to the gathered crowd. "Lord Stark is innocent." A murmur spread. Joffrey looked to his mother. Cersei's face was like stone, but her mind was already racing. Ned Stark had won his freedom. But the game was not over. The stunned silence that followed Sir Gregor Clegane's fall seemed to stretch for an eternity. The mountain had been invincible, unstoppable, and yet there he lay, a massive, lifeless heap of flesh and steel. The crimson stain spreading beneath him was proof that even the mightiest could fall. Ned Stark had won. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, swelling into outright disbelief. A trial by combat was sacred, its verdict the will of the gods. Ned was innocent in the eyes of both the law and the Seven. Sir Barristan Selmy stood over his fallen foe, his sword still slick with Gregor's blood. His chest heaved, sweat glistening on his weathered face, but his hands were steady. He had done what few had thought possible. He had slain the mountain. And now, by all rights, Eddard Stark was a free man. But the throne had other plans. Joffrey Baratheon's boyish face twisted into something ugly. Anger, frustration, disbelief. He had wanted to see Ned Stark's head roll, not watching the old man walk free. "No!" Joffrey's voice rang out, petulant and sharp. "This is wrong! He is a traitor!" Cersei's fingers dug into the armrest of her seat. She had not expected this outcome. Her mind was already racing, calculating their next move. "The gods have spoken," Barristan declared, turning to the gathered court. His voice carried the weight of authority, a challenge to anyone who dared deny it. "Lord Stark is innocent." The King's Guard exchanged uneasy glances. Sir Jaime Lannister, watching from his place beside the Queen, smirked faintly but said nothing. Varys remained still, his expression unreadable. Littlefinger, on the other hand, had that same amused glint in his eyes, as if this turn of events was just another game for him to enjoy. Joffrey, however, was unwilling to accept defeat. "I am the king. I decide who lives and who dies." His voice cracked with rage, his small fists clenching at his sides. "Guards, seize him!" For a moment no one moved. Even the gold cloaks, usually quick to obey, hesitated. To act now would mean violating the sacred laws of trial by combat. It would mean openly defying the gods. Cersei rose slowly, placing a hand on Joffrey's arm, her voice a quiet whisper meant only for him. "Not here. Not now." The young king's nostrils flared, but he obeyed, settling back onto the Iron Throne with a sullen expression. His mother turned to the gathered court, her lips curling into a forced smile. "Of course the crown respects the will of the gods," she said smoothly. "Lord Stark is free to take the black, as was previously arranged." Ned narrowed his eyes slightly. That was not part of the agreement, but before he could speak, Sir Barristan stepped forward. "That is not the law," the old knight said firmly. "A man proven innocent cannot be punished." Cersei's smile did not falter, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her anger. It was Lord Stark's original wish, was it not? She turned to Ned, her voice dripping with poison sweetness. "You wanted to take the black, did you not, my lord? You wished to live, did you not?" Ned understood the threat beneath her words. They would not let him walk free. Not truly. If he stayed in King's Landing, he would not last a fortnight before an accident claimed his life. His only chance of survival was to leave the city behind, to go to the Wall, where the Lannisters' reach would be weak. Sansa was watching him, her blue eyes wide with hope. He would not risk her safety, not after everything she had already endured. He exhaled slowly, then gave a single nod. I will take the black." A victorious gleam flashed in Cersei's eyes, but she masked it well. "Then it is settled." She gestured to the guards. "Lord Stark will be escorted to the Wall at once." Joffrey did not look satisfied, but he said nothing. As the tension in the courtyard eased, the gathered crowd began to disperse. The spectacle was over. But for Ned Stark, the true danger had only just begun. Sir Barristan approached him, lowering his voice. "You are not safe here." Ned met his gaze. "I know." The Wall was his only escape, but whether he would survive the journey was another matter entirely. The weight of unseen eyes followed Ned Stark as he was led back through the halls of the Red Keep. He was no longer a prisoner in chains, yet the invisible bonds of Lannister control still shackled him. Every step felt heavy, his mind racing through the dangers ahead. He had won his trial, but the game was far from over. Sir Barristan Selmy walked beside him, his face grim. "Cersei will not let this stand," he murmured. "You humiliated her today. The moment you step outside the Red Keep, you are in danger." Ned nodded. He had known that the moment he accepted the deal. Taking the black was meant to be his way out, but now it was little more than an excuse for the Lannisters to remove him from the capital. and possibly kill him before he ever reached the wall. Outside the castle, the streets of King's Landing were still buzzing with talk of the trial. The common folk had seen something they never expected. Sir Gregor Clegane, the mountain himself, slain. To some it was a sign that justice still existed. To others it was a warning that the balance of power could shift at any moment. But Ned had no illusions. Cersei was already planning her next move. At the docks, a small party was waiting for him. A black-sailed ship sat in the harbor, its hull bearing the mark of House Stark. A handful of gold cloaks stood beside it, along with a few riders clad in the crimson and gold of Lannister livery. They were not here for ceremony. They were here to watch. Varys, ever the spider, stepped forward, his hands folded inside his sleeves. "Lord Stark," he said in that smooth, unreadable tone, "I trust you understand the delicacy of your situation." Ned regarded him coolly. "I understand that I leave under watchful eyes." Varys gave a thin smile. "Quite so. The Queen is generous, allowing you to take the black rather than—" He let the words trail off, letting the implication hang between them. "Spare me the courtesies, Lord Varys," Ned said. "What does she intend?" The spy master tilted his head, as if considering whether to speak honestly. "The Queen will keep her word so long as it benefits her, but there are others who may act on her behalf." Ned understood. Assassins, cutthroats, paid hands willing to do what the Queen herself could not. He would not make it to the wall unless he was careful. Sir Barristan stepped closer. "I will go with you." Ned's brows lifted. "You owe me nothing, sir." "I owe Joffrey nothing," Selmy corrected. "The boy is no true king, and if I remain in this city, it is only a matter of time before Cersei has me killed. At the wall, I may still have a purpose." Ned studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then I welcome your company." A movement at the edge of the crowd caught his eye. A girl in a hood, slipping between the onlookers. Ned's heart clenched. Arya, she was here, watching. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Then she was gone, disappearing back into the maze of the city. Ned exhaled slowly. She was alive. That was enough. Varys gestured toward the ship. "The sooner you leave, the better. A ship will take you to Eastwatch. From there, you will travel to Castle Black." Ned gave him a final glance. "And what do you gain from this, Lord Varys?" The spider smiled faintly. "A realm at peace." Ned boarded the ship, Sir Barristan at his side. The sails unfurled, and the city of King's Landing began to shrink behind them. But he knew the Lannisters would not let him go so easily. The road to the wall would be long and dangerous, and Ned Stark was not done fighting yet. The ship cut through the dark waves, its black sails billowing under the cold sea breeze. Ned stood at the bow, watching as King's Landing faded into the distance. The stench of the city, the rot, the sweat, the filth, was finally behind him, yet he felt no relief. His fate was still uncertain. Sir Barristan Selmy stood beside him, his cloak rustling in the wind. "They will try to stop us," he said without pretense. "The Lannisters will not let you reach the wall alive." Ned nodded. "I know." Varys had arranged for the ship to take them north to Eastwatch by the sea, far from the Lannisters' immediate grasp. But Cersei had agents everywhere. Assassins could be waiting in any port, bandits on any road. And there was still Joffrey. The boy king had wanted Ned dead. Losing the trial had embarrassed him, and men like Joffrey never forgot a slight. Even if Cersei allowed Ned to leave, her son might act on his own. A royal decree was all it would take, As the ship sailed further from the capital, the crew worked in tense silence. They were loyal to neither the Starks nor the Lannisters, only to the coin Varys had promised them. Ned trusted none of them. By nightfall, the waters grew restless. The sky was a vast expanse of stars, but there was no peace beneath it. Ned barely slept, his hand never far from the dagger he had taken from the ship's supply. If the Lannisters came for him, he would not go quietly. On the third night at sea, trouble found them. A second ship appeared on the horizon, its sails bearing no sigil, its purpose clear. "Pirates," one of the crew muttered. But Ned knew better. Lannister men. The ship gained on them quickly, and by dawn, it was clear they would not escape. As the enemy vessel pulled alongside them, grappling hooks flew through the air, latching onto the wooden railings. Heavily armed men in dark leathers swarmed onto the deck. Ned drew his sword. Sir Barristan stood beside him, his blade already slick with blood from the first man he had cut down. "Stay behind me, Lord Stark," he said, striking down another foe with a fluid motion. "I am not ready for the gods just yet." The battle was fast and brutal. The Lannister men fought without banners, but their tactics were unmistakable. This was no random pirate attack. Steel clashed against steel. Ned parried a wild strike, driving his blade into an attacker's chest. A scream cut through the night as Sir Barristan slashed through two more. The old knight moved like a man half his age, his experience turning every motion into a dance of death. But there were too many of them. A blade scraped against Ned's ribs, cutting through his tunic but missing flesh. He stumbled back, barely deflecting another blow. The crew of his ship fought as best they could, but it was clear who had the advantage. Then above the chaos, a familiar voice called out, "Lord Stark!" Ned turned just in time to see a hooded figure leaping onto the deck from the enemy ship. Small, quick, Arya. She moved like a shadow, darting between the chaos, a stolen dagger flashing in her grip. She was too small to fight the armored men directly, but she was fast. One of the Lannister men turned to grab her, and she plunged the dagger into his thigh, twisting hard. He howled and collapsed. "Arya!" Ned shouted, cutting down another foe to get to her. She turned, eyes blazing, breath heavy. "I wasn't going to let them take you." Sir Barristan had no time to question her presence. Another wave of attackers was coming. "We need to take the fight to them," he said. "If we stay here, we die." Ned hesitated. The safest thing to do would be to surrender. Let them take him alive. But they wouldn't take Arya alive. They would kill her. His grip tightened on his sword. "Then we fight." The three of them pushed forward, cutting their way across the deck. Arya darted between legs, slashing at exposed flesh. Ned fought with all the strength he had left. Sir Barristan was unstoppable, cutting down men with an efficiency that made it clear why he had been called Barristan the Bold. The tide of battle began to turn. One of the enemy crew, seeing the way things were going, grabbed Arya from behind. She struggled, biting and kicking, but he held fast, a blade pressed to her throat. "Enough!" he shouted. "Drop your weapons, or the girl dies." Ned froze. Sir Barristan halted beside him, both their swords dripping with blood. Arya's wide eyes met Ned's. He saw the fight still in her, but she was small, overpowered. One wrong move, and she would die. Ned's heart pounded. Then with terrifying speed, Arya slammed her head back into her captor's face. He stumbled, loosening his grip just enough. She twisted free, grabbed his wrist, and drove her dagger into his throat. Blood sprayed across the deck as the man fell. Arya stood over him, panting, her small chest rising and falling. The ship fell silent. The last of the attackers had either been slain or thrown overboard. The battle was over. Arya wiped her dagger on her sleeve and looked up at Ned. "I wasn't going to let them take you," she repeated. Ned stared at her, at the blood on her hands, at the fire in her eyes. His little girl was gone. Before he could speak, Sir Barristan exhaled and sheathed his sword. "We must leave this ship," he said. "The Lannisters will send more." Ned looked at his daughter one last time before nodding. "Then we go." The aftermath of the battle lingered in the salty air as Ned, Arya, and Sir Barristan stood among the fallen bodies. The ship groaned beneath them, its deck slick with blood, the smell of death mixing with the ocean breeze. The surviving crew of Ned's vessel, those who had not turned tail or been cut down, looked shaken but loyal enough. For now, they had seen what happened to those who betrayed their passengers. Ned wiped the blood from his sword before returning it to its sheath. His eyes fell on Arya, her small hand still gripping the dagger she had used to kill a man. His daughter had always been wild, but this was different. This was no childhood game of swords. She had taken a life. "You shouldn't have been here," he said, his voice low but firm. Arya scowled, wiping her dagger on her sleeve. "And you shouldn't have been in that dungeon." She met his gaze defiantly. "You were going to die. I couldn't let that happen." Ned sighed, kneeling in front of her. "This isn't the life I wanted for you, Arya." She lifted her chin. "It's the life I have." Sir Barristan watched the exchange silently, before finally speaking. "Lord Stark, we cannot stay on the ship. Even if the crew is loyal, the Lannisters will send more men. We need to reach land and find another way north." Ned exhaled. He knew the old knight was right. The wall was still far away, and every day they remained on this ship was another day closer to disaster. He turned to the captain, a grizzled man with a missing tooth and a nervous expression. "Where is the closest port?" "Salt Pans," the captain said. "A few days' ride to the Trident. From there you can go north." Salt Pans. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than waiting to die at sea. "Take us there," Ned ordered. The captain hesitated, then nodded. "Aye, my lord." Days later, under the cover of night, they arrived at Salt Pans, a small fishing town on the eastern coast of Westeros. Unlike King's Landing, it was quiet, a forgotten place untouched by the chaos brewing in the realm. Ned, Arya, and Sir Barristan disembarked quickly, avoiding attention. They needed horses, supplies, and a plan. Sir Barristan pulled his cloak tighter over his armor. "We should avoid major roads," he said. "If the Lannisters are hunting you, they'll have men in every town from here to Winterfell." Ned agreed. "We'll follow the river north, through the Riverlands." The Riverlands. Stark territory in theory. But war was coming. If Robb had already called his banners, the land would soon be swarming with soldiers, Lannister and Stark alike, and war meant danger. They found a stable on the outskirts of town where Ned managed to buy 3 horses with what little coin they had. Arya beamed as she mounted her own, the thrill of adventure shining in her eyes. Sir Barristan was more wary. He had been a soldier long enough to know that safety was an illusion. As they prepared to leave, a voice called out, "Lord Stark!" Ned's hand flew to his sword. Arya tensed. Sir Barristan turned, ready for a fight. But the man who approached wasn't a Lannister agent. He was cloaked in rough-spun wool, a hood shadowing his face. When he stepped closer, Ned finally recognized him. Yoren, the Black Brother of the Night's Watch, The same man who had been in King's Landing gathering recruits before everything fell apart. Yoren spit onto the ground. "Heard you were dead," he muttered. "Guess the Lannisters are slipping." Ned lowered his sword but did not relax. "What are you doing here?" "Recruiting for the Watch, same as always." Yoren's eyes flicked to Arya. "Took a wrong turn, did she?" Arya glared. "I saved him." Yoren snorted. "That's so?" He turned back to Ned. "You need to get north, and I need to take new recruits there. We might be able to help each other." Sir Barristan stepped forward. "And why should we trust you?" "Because," Yoren said, pulling a scroll from his cloak, "I have a royal decree, signed before all this madness started, allowing me safe passage through every part of the realm." Ned took the scroll and unrolled it. It was legitimate. Sir Barristan exchanged a glance with Ned. "This could get us through Lannister patrols." Ned nodded slowly. "Then we travel together." Yoren smirked. "Good, but let's get moving. You've got a price on your head, Lord Stark, and gold makes men greedy." With that, they rode north toward the unknown. The war was coming, and Ned Stark still had a part to play in it. The road north was long and treacherous. Days turned to weeks as Ned Stark, Arya, Sir Barristan Selmy, and Yoren of the Night's Watch rode through the Riverlands. They moved under the cover of darkness, avoiding the major roads and keeping to the woods when they could. Every town, every village carried the risk of betrayal. News of Ned Stark's trial and escape had spread, and while the Lannisters controlled King's Landing, the Riverlands were a battleground. War had already begun. Robb Stark had called his banners. The young wolf marched south, and the Riverlands were painted in blood. Villages burned in the distance. Refugees fled down the roads, and the air stank of death. For all his efforts to avoid patrols, Ned knew it was only a matter of time before they ran into trouble, and trouble found them near the Trident. They had stopped for the night in the ruins of an old watchtower, making camp in the shadows. The fire was kept small, just enough to warm their hands. Yoren sat sharpening his knife, muttering about how the Night's Watch had better food than this. Arya practiced with her stolen dagger, stabbing at an invisible enemy. She had been restless since they left Salt Pans. The excitement of battle hadn't left her. If anything, it had only hardened her. Sir Barristan stood watch, his sword always within reach. The old knight barely spoke, but his presence was reassuring. Ned leaned against the cold stone wall, exhaustion tugging at his bones. He wasn't the same man who had ridden south all those months ago. He had been a lord, a father, a hand of the king. Now he was an outlaw, running for his life in a kingdom that was tearing itself apart. The gods had spared him once. Would they spare him again? Then the sound came. Hoofbeats, many of them. Sir Barristan was on his feet instantly, his sword drawn. Yoren cursed, scrambling for his crossbow. Ned stood, his hand tightening around his hilt. Arya, without hesitation, melted into the shadows. Within moments, the camp was surrounded. Torches flared in the darkness, and armored riders emerged from the trees. Their cloaks bore the red and gold of House Lannister. A knight rode forward, his face hidden behind a lion-crested helm. His voice was sharp and confident. "Lord Stark," he called, "by the authority of King Joffrey, you are under arrest for treason." Ned's grip tightened. "I won my trial by combat. The gods judge me innocent." The knight scoffed. "The king does not recognize the gods' decision. You will come with us, or you will die here." Sir Barristan stepped beside Ned, his sword reflecting the torchlight. "If you want him, he said. "Come and take him." For a moment there was silence. Then the knight raised his hand. The battle began. The Lannister soldiers charged. Sir Barristan moved like a storm, cutting down the first rider before he even had the chance to swing his sword. His movements were precise, fluid, every strike a death sentence. Ned fought beside him, his blade clashing against a Lannister shield. He was slower than he once was, but his skill had not faded completely. He parried a strike, then drove his sword into his attacker's stomach. Yoren loosed a bolt from his crossbow, hitting a soldier square in the throat. "I told you they'd come!" he shouted, drawing his dagger. Arya appeared like a ghost, slipping between the chaos, her dagger flashing in the firelight. She moved like a shadow, striking at the backs of knees, cutting throats when no one was looking. She was small, but she was deadly. For a moment it seemed they might hold their ground, but more soldiers kept coming. A sword slashed across Yoren's leg, sending him tumbling to the ground. A Lannister man loomed over him, blade raised, only to fall as Arya plunged her dagger into his back. Ned barely had time to register what had happened before an armored fist slammed into his ribs, knocking him down. His vision blurred as the weight of a soldier pinned him, his sword wrenched from his grasp. Through the haze he saw the lion-helmed knight standing over him, his sword raised. "Your luck has run out, Stark." The blade came down, clang. Sir Barristan blocked the strike, his sword locking with the knight's. With a powerful twist, he knocked the knight off balance and drove his blade deep into his chest. The knight gasped, then slumped to the ground. With their leader dead, the remaining Lannister soldiers hesitated. That was all the opening they needed. Sir Barristan grabbed Ned's arm, hauling him to his feet. "We need to move." Yoren, limping but alive, scrambled onto a fallen soldier's horse. Arya darted between the chaos, picking up a discarded sword. They mounted the horses of the fallen Lannister men and fled into the night. They rode for hours, the cold wind howling around them. Only when they were certain no one followed did they slow their pace. They had won, but barely. Yoren gritted his teeth as he examined his wounded leg. "If I die," he muttered, "don't send me to the wall." Sir Barristan smirked. "You'd be lucky to have it." Ned turned to Arya, who was quiet. Too quiet. "You saved Yoren," he said softly. Arya met his gaze, her hand still gripping her stolen sword. "I didn't want him to die." Ned placed a hand on her shoulder. "You are a Stark of Winterfell." She looked up at him. "Then why are we running?" Ned exhaled. "Because war has come, and I must return to my son." They were close now. The North was within reach. The Lannisters had tried to kill him, but they had failed. And Ned Stark, thought dead and gone, would soon return home. But war did not wait for one man. The Game of Thrones raged on, and winter was coming.